The rain slammed against the penthouse windows, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out the city's hum below. Mason stood frozen, his hands hovering over the massage table, as Ethan's towel slipped to the floor, revealing a vulnerability that made Mason's heart lurch. In that fleeting second, the world narrowed to the curve of Ethan's shoulder, the quiet trust in his hazel eyes, and the tremor in Mason's fingers that betrayed a longing he'd buried for years. Mason, 25, had built a life of control. Growing up in a small Ohio town where whispers about boys like him carried like poison, he'd learned to hide his truth behind a charming smile and a meticulously crafted persona. Now a sought-after massage therapist in Manhattan, he thrived on discipline. Every muscle knot he worked out, every client he soothed, was a testament to his ability to keep his own desires in check. But Ethan, a new client with a disarming laugh and a story Mason didn't yet know, was unraveling that control with every breath. The spa room, tucked into a sleek Upper East Side penthouse, smelled of cedarwood and lavender. Mason had been hired for a private session, a favor for a wealthy regular who'd insisted Ethan needed healing hands. Ethan, 24, was a graphic designer who'd moved to New York from Seattle, chasing a dream job at a top ad agency. He'd walked in with a nervous energy, his blonde hair slightly mussed, his navy t-shirt clinging to his frame in a way that made Mason's pulse quicken. "I've never done this before," Ethan had admitted, his voice soft but steady. "My boss says you're the best." Mason had laughed it off, slipping into his professional mask. "Just relax. I got you." But as Ethan lay on the table, his skin warm under Mason's hands, the air grew thick with something unspoken. Mason's fingers glided over Ethan's back, tracing the tension in his shoulders, the subtle scars that hinted at a past he hadn't shared. Each touch felt like a question, and Ethan's quiet sighs were answers Mason wasn't sure he could handle. Then the towel fell. It was an accident, Ethan shifting slightly, the fabric catching on the table's edge, but the moment stretched into eternity. Mason's hands froze mid-motion, his breath catching as Ethan turned his head, their eyes locking. There was no shame in Ethan's gaze, only a quiet curiosity, as if he'd been waiting for Mason to see him, truly see him. "You okay?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but it hit Mason like a thunderclap. Mason's voice cracked, and he cursed himself for it. He was supposed to be the steady one, the professional. But his hands were trembling now, betraying the storm inside him. He wanted to look away, to retreat to the safety of his routine. But Ethan's gaze held him captive. There was something raw in it, something that said Ethan saw through the walls Mason had spent years building. "I'm fine," Mason managed, forcing a smile as he reached for the towel, draping it back over Ethan with a care that felt too intimate. But Ethan's hand caught his wrist, gentle but firm, stopping him. "You don't have to do that," Ethan said, his voice steady now, almost daring. "I'm not embarrassed." Mason's heart pounded so loudly he was sure Ethan could hear it. He pulled his hand back, stepping away from the table, the room suddenly too small, too warm. "We should keep going," he said, his voice tight. But Ethan sat up, the towel loosely draped over his lap, his expression unreadable. "Mason," Ethan said, his name sounding like a confession. "What's wrong?" "What was wrong?" "Everything." The way Ethan's presence made Mason feel exposed. The way his own heart was screaming for something he'd sworn never to chase. He'd spent years dodging feelings like this, keeping his relationships shallow, his desires locked away. But Ethan, with his quiet strength and unguarded warmth, was a crack in that armor, and Mason wasn't sure he could seal it shut again. "I don't know you," Mason said finally, his voice raw. "But I feel like I do. And that's dangerous." Ethan's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Maybe it's supposed to be. The words hung between them, heavy with possibility. Mason wanted to run, to end the session and retreat to the safety of his solitary life. But something in Ethan's eyes, a flicker of hope, of defiance, kept him rooted to the spot. For the first time in years, Mason felt the weight of his own heart, and it terrified him as much as it thrilled him. As the rain continued to lash the windows, Mason took a shaky breath, stepping back toward the table. "Lie down," he said, his voice softened now, almost a plea. "Let's finish this." Ethan complied, but the air had changed. Every touch now carried a current, every glance a promise. Mason didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just a massage anymore. It was the beginning of something he couldn't control, and for once, he wasn't sure he wanted to. The hum of the city below felt like a distant pulse as Mason's hands moved over Ethan's shoulders. Each motion deliberate, but charged with something he couldn't name. The towel incident had shifted everything, and though Ethan lay still, his breathing was a quiet rhythm that seemed to sync with Mason's heartbeat. The spa room, with its warm candlelight and sleek wooden walls, felt like a cocoon, sealing them off from the world and its judgments. Mason tried to focus on the routine, need, glide, release, but his mind was a storm. Ethan's words, maybe it's supposed to be, echoed like a challenge. He'd spent years perfecting the art of detachment, keeping clients at arm's length. But Ethan was different. His vulnerability, his openness, was a mirror Mason wasn't ready to face. Yet every time Ethan sighed under his touch, Mason felt a pull, like gravity, drawing him closer to a line he'd sworn never to cross. Ethan shifted slightly, his voice breaking the silence. "You're good at this," he said, his tone light, but laced with something deeper. "But I bet you hear that all the time." Mason's lips twitched into a half smile. "Some clients are more vocal than others." He paused, his hands resting on Ethan's lower back, the warmth of his skin seeping into Mason's palms. "You're quieter," Ethan chuckled, the sound soft and unguarded. "Maybe I'm just trying to figure you out." Mason's hands stilled, his breath catching. "Not much to figure out," he said, forcing a casual tone. "Just a guy doing his job." "Bullshit," Ethan said, his voice playful but firm. He turned his head, catching Mason's gaze over his shoulder. "You're not just anything. I saw the way you looked at me when the towel fell. You're not as closed off as you think." Mason's chest tightened, a mix of fear and exhilaration surging through him. He wanted to laugh it off, to retreat to the safety of professionalism. But Ethan's eyes held him in place, daring him to be honest. "You don't know me," Mason said, echoing his earlier words. But they felt weaker now, less convincing. "Then tell me," Ethan said, sitting up again, the towel slipping slightly but staying in place this time. He turned to face Mason fully, his expression open, almost pleading. Tell me who you are when you're not this. He gestured vaguely at the room, the table, the role Mason played. Mason stepped back, running a hand through his dark hair, his green eyes flickering with conflict. I don't do that, he said, his voice low. I don't let people in. It's safer that way. Ethan's brow furrowed, but his gaze didn't waver. Safer for who? You? Or the people you push away? The question hit like a punch. Mason thought of his childhood in Ohio. The slurs scrawled on his locker. The way his father's silence hurt more than any word could. He'd left that town behind, built a new life in New York. But the fear of being seen, truly seen, had followed him. He'd dated, sure, but always kept it light, fleeting, never letting anyone close enough to hurt him. Until now. I'm not pushing you away, Mason said, but the words felt like a lie. He turned away, busying himself with folding a spare towel, anything to avoid Ethan's gaze. You're a client. This is my job. Ethan slid off the table. Standing now, the towel knotted loosely around his waist. He took a step closer, close enough that Mason could feel the warmth radiating from him. Then why are your hands shaking? Ethan asked softly, his voice a mix of curiosity and challenge. Mason glanced down, cursing himself as he saw the faint tremor in his fingers. He clenched them into fists, shoving them into his pockets. You're reading too much into this, he said, but his voice betrayed him, cracking under the weight of his own denial. Ethan didn't move, didn't push, but his presence was enough. I'm not asking for everything. Mason, he said. Just something real. One truth. Give me that. Mason's throat tightened. He wanted to tell Ethan to leave, to end this session and never come back. But the truth clawed its way up, raw and unfiltered. I'm scared, he admitted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. I've spent my whole life hiding who I am, and you make me want to stop. And that scares the hell out of me. Ethan's expression softened, a quiet understanding settling over him. He reached out, his hand hovering near Mason's arm, but not touching, as if waiting for permission. You don't have to hide with me, he said. I see you. And I'm not going anywhere. The words were a lifeline, but Mason wasn't ready to grab it. Not yet. He stepped back, forcing a shaky smile. Session's over, he said, his voice barely steady. You should get dressed. Ethan nodded, but the look in his eyes said this wasn't the end. As he gathered his clothes and headed to the changing room, Mason sank onto a stool, his heart racing. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, but inside, the storm was just beginning. The next week passed in a blur, but Ethan's words lingered in Mason's mind like a song he couldn't shake. He went through his appointments on autopilot, his hands steady for every client except when he thought of Ethan. Then the tremor returned, a quiet rebellion against his carefully guarded heart. By the time Ethan booked another session, Mason was a tangle of nerves, torn between wanting to cancel and craving the chance to see him again. The spa room felt different this time, the air heavier despite the same cedarwood scent and soft lighting. Ethan walked in, his blonde hair catching the candlelight, his hazel eyes bright with a mix of nervousness and determination. He wore a fitted gray t-shirt and black jeans, his lean frame moving with a quiet confidence that made Mason's stomach flip. Back for more of your magic hands, Ethan teased, but there was an edge to his voice, a question beneath the humor. Mason forced a laugh, gesturing to the table. You know the drill. Shirt off. Lie down. He tried to keep it light, professional, but his voice sounded strained, even to himself. Ethan complied, peeling off his shirt and settling onto the table, his back a canvas of smooth skin and subtle scars that Mason now knew by heart. As Mason's hands worked over Ethan's shoulders, he felt the tension in the room shift. Ethan was quieter this time, his sighs replaced by a stillness that felt deliberate, as if he were waiting for something. Mason's fingers traced the lines of Ethan's muscles, each touch a battle between restraint and desire. He wanted to ask about the scars, about the life that had brought Ethan here, but the words felt too heavy, too personal. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You didn't call," he said, his voice low, almost accusatory. "I left my number with the front desk." "Thought you might." Mason's hands paused, his heart stuttering. He'd seen the note, Ethan's number scrawled in neat handwriting, but he'd left it untouched, afraid of what it meant. "I don't call clients," he said, the excuse sounding hollow even to him. Ethan turned his head, his eyes searching Mason's face. "I'm not just a client, and you know it." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Mason stepped back, wiping his hands on a towel, his mind racing. "Ethan, I can't do this," he said, his voice raw. "You don't know what you're asking." "Then tell me," Ethan said, sitting up, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me why you're so afraid of this." "Of us." Mason's chest ached, the weight of years of silence pressing down on him. He thought of his father's cold disapproval, the friends who'd turned away when he came out, the nights he'd spent alone in a city that promised freedom but delivered isolation. "I've lost too much to let myself want this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I let someone in, it ends in pain. I can't do that again." Ethan slid off the table, standing close enough that Mason could feel the heat of his presence. "I'm not them," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm not your past. I'm just a guy who sees you, Mason. And I'm not asking for forever. I'm asking for a chance." Mason's throat tightened, his eyes burning. He wanted to believe Ethan, to trust that this could be different. But fear was a powerful anchor. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice breaking. "To grow up knowing you're different, knowing you have to hide. I've spent my whole life pretending. Ethan, I don't know how to stop." Ethan reached out, his hand resting lightly on Mason's arm, the touch grounding and electric all at once. "You don't have to stop," he said. "Just start. With me." For a moment, Mason stood frozen, caught between the safety of his walls and the pull of Ethan's warmth. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand, covering Ethan's, their fingers intertwining. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a leap, a crack in the armor he'd worn for so long. "Okay," Mason whispered, the word a surrender and a promise. "Okay." Ethan's smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds, warm and unguarded. He didn't push, didn't demand more, just stood there, his hands steady in Mason's. The session ended, but neither moved to leave. They sat on the edge of the massage table, talking quietly, the city's hum fading into the background. For the first time in years, Mason felt like he was breathing, really breathing, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling of Mason's defenses. He and Ethan started meeting outside the spa, coffee shops in Brooklyn, late-night walks along the Hudson, quiet moments where words felt less important than the way their shoulders brushed. Each encounter chipped away at Mason's fear, but the shadow of his past lingered, whispering that this happiness was fragile, temporary. Ethan was patient, his humor and warmth a steady anchor. He shared pieces of his own story, growing up in Seattle with supportive parents, coming out in high school to a mix of acceptance and cruelty, finding solace in art. His scars, he revealed, were from a car accident at 19, a reckless night that left him with a shattered leg and a renewed appreciation for life. "I learned to stop running from what I want," he told Mason one evening, their hands linked as they sat on a park bench, the city lights glittering across the water. "That's why I'm here. With you." Mason wanted to believe he could be that brave, but doubt clung to him like damp clothes. He hadn't told Ethan everything about the night his father kicked him out at 17, about the ex who'd promised love only to leave when things got real. Those memories were wounds he hadn't reopened, and he wasn't sure he could. One night, Ethan invited Mason to his apartment in Williamsburg, a cozy loft filled with sketches and half-finished canvases. Ethan cooked dinner, pasta with a slightly burned sauce that made them both laugh, and they sat cross-legged on the floor, sharing stories over cheap wine. The intimacy of it, the ease, felt like a dream Mason didn't trust himself to keep. "You're quiet tonight," Ethan said, setting his glass down, his hazel eyes searching Mason's face. "What's going on in there?" He tapped his temple lightly, a teasing smile softening the question. Mason hesitated, the weight of his unspoken truths pressing down. "I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop," he admitted. It feels too good. Like it's going to fall apart." Ethan's smile faded, replaced by a quiet intensity. "You think I'm going to hurt you," he said. Not a question, but a realization. "Mason, I'm not that guy. But you've got to let me in." "All the way." Mason's chest tightened, the familiar urge to run surging through him. But Ethan's hand found his, grounding him, and for once, Mason didn't pull away. "I want to," he said, his voice raw. "But there's stuff I haven't told you. Stuff I'm ashamed of." Ethan's grip tightened, his expression unwavering. "Then tell me. I can handle it." So Mason did. He told Ethan about his father, the shouting matches, the night he'd been thrown out with nothing but a backpack and a bruised heart. He told him about his first love, a college boyfriend who'd promised forever but left when Mason's insecurities became too much. Each word felt like peeling back skin, exposing raw nerves. But Ethan listened, his silence a safe harbor. When Mason finished, his eyes were wet, his hands shaking again. Ethan pulled him close, wrapping his arms around him, and Mason let himself sink into the embrace, the warmth of it chasing away the cold of his memories. "You're not broken," Ethan whispered, his voice fierce. "You're just you." And that's enough. They stayed like that for a long time, the loft quiet except for the distant hum of the city. Mason felt something shift inside him, a crack widening into a space where hope could grow. He wasn't healed, not yet, but with Ethan's arms around him, he believed he could be. As they lay together on Ethan's couch, the city lights casting shadows across the room, Mason realized he was falling, not just for Ethan, but for the possibility of a life where he didn't have to hide. It was terrifying, But for the first time, he wanted to face that fear, to see where it led. The months that followed were a dance of joy and uncertainty. Mason and Ethan grew closer, their lives intertwining in ways Mason hadn't thought possible. They spent weekends exploring the city, art galleries in Chelsea, jazz clubs in Harlem, quiet moments in Central Park where Ethan sketched while Mason read. Each moment felt like a gift, but Mason couldn't shake the fear that it was borrowed time. Ethan's confidence was infectious, but Mason's past was a shadow that lingered. He started opening up to his friends, introducing Ethan as his boyfriend, the word feeling foreign but right on his tongue. His friends embraced Ethan, but Mason noticed the subtle shifts: clients who canceled appointments, whispers at the spa about his new lifestyle. New York was progressive, but not immune to judgment, and Mason felt the old wounds reopening. One evening, as they walked through the village, hand in hand, a group of guys shouted slurs from across the street. Mason tensed, his grip on Ethan's hand tightening, but Ethan just squeezed back, his voice calm. "Ignore them," he said. "They don't get to ruin this." But the words lingered, stirring memories of Ohio, of the fear that had defined Mason's youth. He pulled away, his steps quickening, and Ethan had to jog to keep up. "Mason, talk to me," he said, catching his arm. "Don't shut me out." Mason stopped, his breath uneven, the city lights blurring through unshed tears. "I thought I was past this," he said, his voice shaking. "But it's still there. The fear, the shame. I don't know how to make it stop." Ethan's expression softened, but there was a fire in his eyes. "You don't have to make it stop," he said. "You just have to keep going. With me." Mason wanted to believe him, but the weight of the world felt heavier than ever. That night, back at Ethan's loft, they argued for the first time. Mason's insecurities spilled out, his fear of losing Ethan, of not being enough, of the world's judgment tearing them apart. Ethan listened, his patience fraying, until he finally snapped. "I'm not going anywhere." "Mason," he said, his voice sharp. "But you've got to stop running from this. From us." The words cut deep, and Mason left, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in his chest. He spent the night wandering the city, the lights and noise a blur. He thought of Ethan's warmth, his laughter, the way he'd made Mason feel seen. But he also thought of the risks of heartbreak, of rejection, of a world that didn't always accept love like theirs. By dawn, Mason found himself outside Ethan's building, his heart pounding. He buzzed the intercom, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said when Ethan answered, his voice thick with sleep and worry. "I'm scared, but I don't want to lose you." Ethan let him in, and they stood in the loft, the morning light casting soft shadows. "I'm scared too," Ethan admitted, his voice soft. "But I'd rather face that fear with you than without you." Mason nodded, tears spilling over as he pulled Ethan close. They held each other, the weight of their fears shared. Lighter now. Mason knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he believed they could face it together. A year later, Mason stood in the same penthouse spa room where it all began. But this time, he wasn't alone. Ethan was beside him, their hands linked as they set up for a couple's massage workshop they'd started together. A project born from their shared love and Mason's desire to give back. The room was filled with clients, some queer, some straight, all drawn to the safe space they'd created, a place where love and healing intertwined. Mason had changed. The tremors in his hands were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from being loved, truly loved, for who he was. He'd started therapy, unpacking the wounds of his past, and though the scars remained, they no longer defined him. Ethan had been his anchor, his partner in every sense, and together they'd built something beautiful, a life where fear took a back seat to love. That night, after the workshop, they stood on the penthouse balcony, the city sprawling below them. Ethan wrapped an arm around Mason's waist, his warmth a steady presence. "You ever think about that first session?" Ethan asked, a playful glint in his eyes. "When I dropped that towel," Mason laughed, the sound free and unguarded. "Every damn day," he said, leaning into Ethan. "I thought I was done for." "You were," Ethan teased, kissing his temple. "But you're stuck with me now." Mason turned, his green eyes meeting Ethan's hazel ones. And in that moment, the world felt right. He thought of the boy he'd been, hiding in Ohio, and the man he'd become, standing here, unafraid. The journey hadn't been easy. There were still moments of doubt, of judgment from others, but with Ethan by his side, Mason knew he could face anything. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For seeing me. For staying." Ethan's smile was radiant, his hand finding Mason's cheek. "Always," he said, and they kissed. The city lights a backdrop to a love that had weathered fear and emerged stronger. As they stood together, the rain began to fall, soft and steady, a reminder of that first night when everything changed. But this time, Mason didn't tremble. He held Ethan close, his heart full, knowing that whatever storms came, they'd face them together. Their love wasn't just a moment. It was a promise, a future, a home.